My name is Madeline, and 12 years ago, I met James at a business networking event. He was a senior manager at a trading company, charming and intelligent, with kind eyes that made me feel at ease. What really won me over, though, was how he talked about his 13-year-old daughter, Sarah. The love in his voice when he mentioned her name was unmistakable. I'd built my chain of beauty salons from the ground up, and success had brought me everything except what I wanted most, a family. I couldn't have children of my own, a fact I'd learned to live with, but meeting James and Sarah felt like a second chance. We got married 6 months later, and they moved into my house. The income difference between James and me was substantial. I made several times what he did, but it never bothered me. Love isn't about money, and I was just happy to finally have the family I'd always wanted. When Sarah turned 16, I bought her first car, a safe, reliable model that made her squeal with joy. "This is really mine," she'd asked, tears in her eyes as she hugged me. "Thank you, Madeline. You're the best." 2 years later, when college acceptance letters started arriving, I didn't hesitate to offer to pay for her education. It wasn't Harvard, but it was a good school, and Sarah was thrilled. Those early years were beautiful. We were happy. I had everything I'd ever wanted, a loving husband, a stepdaughter who seemed to appreciate me, and a home filled with laughter. Sarah even stayed with us after college, saying she wanted to save money while starting her career. I'll never forget that spring evening when Sarah came home practically glowing with excitement. She'd been dating Michael for 2 years, and I knew him well, a decent young man who worked as a software engineer and treated her like a princess. Still, when she burst through the door waving her left hand with a diamond ring sparkling on it, I was genuinely surprised. "Dad, Madeline," he proposed, she squealed, bouncing on her toes like she was 16 again instead of 25. "We're getting married." James jumped up to hug her while I stood there grinning like an idiot. This was exactly the kind of family moment I'd always dreamed of having. Michael came over later that evening, and we opened a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion. "I know this is a big ask," Sarah said, looking nervous as she played with her engagement ring. "But we've been looking at venues and everything, and—" "How much?" I asked, already reaching for my phone to check my accounts. "Well, with everything included, around 150,000, she said quietly, then rushed to add, "But of course, we don't expect." "Done," I interrupted, smiling. "I'll set up an account tomorrow that you can access for all the wedding expenses." The look of relief and joy on her face made every penny worth it. "Really? Oh my God, Madeline, thank you so much." She threw her arms around me, and I hugged her back tightly, remembering that teenage girl who'd first welcomed me into her life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of excitement. Sarah included me in everything at first. We'd sit at the kitchen table late into the night, looking at wedding magazines and Pinterest boards. She'd text me pictures of dresses she was considering and ask my opinion on color schemes. "What do you think about these flowers?" she'd ask, showing me photos of elaborate bouquets. "Too much? Not enough?" "I love the pink peonies," I'd say, and she'd make notes in her wedding planner. She found her dream dress, a stunning designer gown that cost more than my first car, and I didn't even blink at the price tag. The way her eyes lit up when she tried it on was worth every cent. The venue she chose was spectacular, an elegant historic hotel downtown with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. The menu she selected featured premium dishes that would impress any food critic. I transferred the money as promised, and Sarah dove into the planning with enthusiasm. But then, about 2 months into the planning, something shifted. The detailed updates became shorter, vaguer. Instead of our long planning sessions, she'd rush through dinner and disappear into her room or go to Michael's place. "How's the planning going?" I'd ask. "Fine," she'd reply, barely looking up from her phone. "Everything's on track." When I'd try to get more specific details, she'd give non-committal answers. "Oh, just finalizing some things." Or, "Don't worry, it's all under control." I told myself not to be hurt by this gradual exclusion. After all, planning a wedding is stressful, and she was probably just overwhelmed. Maybe she needed some space to make her own decisions. I remembered being young and wanting to prove I could handle things on my own. James noticed my concern one night as we got ready for bed. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You seem worried." "I'm probably just being silly," I said, trying to smile. "It's just, Sarah seems different lately. More distant." "She's just busy with the wedding," he assured me, kissing my forehead. "You know how it is, so many details to manage. Try not to worry." I nodded and tried to push my concerns aside. But there was a nagging feeling in my gut that something wasn't quite right. The happy bubble we'd been living in felt like it was starting to develop tiny cracks, and I couldn't shake the sensation that this was just the beginning. As the weeks passed, I decided to take a more active role in the wedding planning again. One morning, over coffee, I casually brought up something that had been on my mind. "Sarah, honey, I was wondering about the guest list," I said, watching her scroll through her phone. "Have you figured out how many people you're inviting?" She looked up briefly. "Oh, yeah, we're keeping it small, about 50 people." "That's nice, intimate," I nodded, then added, "I'd love to include my parents and my sister. They've always adored you, and they'd be thrilled to be there." The change in Sarah's expression was immediate and startling. Her face hardened, and she put down her phone with deliberate slowness. "Actually, we're only inviting close relatives and friends. This is supposed to be a really personal celebration. I don't want to include people who aren't, actually family." The words hit me like ice water. After 12 years, after everything we'd shared, my family wasn't actually family to her? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice gentle. "Sarah, I understand wanting to keep things intimate, but my parents have known you since you were 13. They've been to every one of your birthdays, your graduation." I paused, then added quietly, "And I am paying for the entire wedding. Surely we can make an exception for 3 people who care about you." Her face immediately twisted into a pout, and I could see the anger flash in her eyes at the mention of money. She pushed her chair back from the table with more force than necessary. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll send invitations to your mom and sister. Happy now?" Before I could respond, she grabbed her phone and stormed out of the kitchen. I heard the front door slam a few minutes later. That evening, James came into our bedroom with that look on his face, the one that told me I wasn't going to like what he had to say. "We need to talk about what happened with Sarah today," he began, sitting on the edge of our bed. "Okay," I said, putting down my book. "What about it?" "She called me crying earlier. Said you were really rude to her about the guest list. She's staying at Michael's tonight because she's so upset." I stared at him in disbelief. "Rude to her?" "James, she told me my family wasn't welcome at her wedding, a wedding I'm paying for, by the way. And I stayed completely calm when I talked to her about it." "I know, but maybe you could be a little more gentle with her," he suggested. "She's under a lot of stress with the wedding planning." I explained exactly what had happened, word for word, and I could see him processing it. He ran his hand through his hair, something he always did when he was troubled. "Okay," he finally said. "I see what you mean. I'll talk to her about it tomorrow." The next 2 weeks passed in an uneasy peace. Sarah had returned home and was acting as if nothing had happened, chattering about wedding details over breakfast and asking my opinion about centerpieces again. But something felt off, like the calm before a storm. Then came the bombshell at dinner. "So," Sarah said, pushing her pasta around her plate, "Mom found out about the wedding. She's back in town." I nearly choked on my wine. James's fork clattered against his plate. In 12 years, Sarah's mother, Linda, had barely been mentioned in our house. I knew the basics. She'd had a drinking problem, which led to the divorce, then moved to Arizona and essentially abandoned Sarah. No birthday cards, no Christmas calls, nothing. "She really wants to be involved in the wedding planning," Sarah continued, her voice bright with an enthusiasm I couldn't understand. "Actually, I invited her over for dinner this weekend." Here. My hand tightened around my wine glass. This was my house, the house I'd bought with my own money, the house where I'd created a home for us all. The proper thing would have been for Sarah to ask permission before inviting someone over, especially someone with Linda's history. But I remembered the guest list argument and bit my tongue. One more confrontation wasn't worth it. James sat there silently, suddenly very interested in his pasta. That weekend, I spent hours preparing a perfect dinner: herb-crusted rack of lamb, roasted vegetables, homemade bread. I wanted everything to be flawless, though I couldn't explain why I felt the need to impress a woman who'd abandoned her daughter. Linda arrived exactly 30 minutes late. She was tall and blonde like Sarah, but with hard edges where Sarah was soft. Her eyes scanned every inch of my home as she walked in, lingering on the artwork, the furniture, the view from the windows. I recognized the look, envy poorly disguised as appraisal. "What a large house," she said, emphasizing large in a way that made it sound like an insult. Dinner started pleasantly enough, but it didn't stay that way. Linda took a bite of the lamb and pursed her lips. She said, cutting another piece with deliberate slowness. "You know, I always made this with rosemary and garlic. It really brings out the flavor better. Sarah used to love it when I made it." I took a sip of wine and said nothing. "And these vegetables," she continued, pushing them around her plate. "They're a bit overdone, aren't they? I always found that keeping them crispy makes them so much more appetizing." With each criticism, I waited for James to say something, anything. He'd been married to this woman, he knew exactly who she was and what she was doing. But he kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his food into smaller and smaller pieces. I sat there, watching this woman criticize my cooking in my own home, while my husband stayed silent and my stepdaughter beamed at her long-lost mother as if she'd hung the moon. Something inside me shifted, hardened. As dinner wound down, Linda dabbed her lips with her napkin and turned to Sarah. "So, honey, tell me about the venue. Which hotel did you pick?" "The Grand Morrison downtown," Sarah replied, brightening at the change of subject. "It's beautiful, Mom. They have these amazing crystal chandeliers and—" "The Grand Morrison?" Linda's face wrinkled with distaste. "Oh, sweetie, you can't have your wedding there. That place is so basic. Now, the Belmont Plaza, that's where you should be having it. Much more prestigious." I gripped my fork tighter, knowing the Belmont Plaza cost nearly twice what we were already spending. "The wedding we're planning isn't exactly cheap," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The Grand Morrison is a lovely venue." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Well, you can't cut corners on your only daughter's wedding. It's the most important day of her life." Something inside me snapped. 12 years of love, support, and financial sacrifice reduced to cutting corners by a woman who hadn't sent her daughter so much as a birthday card. "If you're so concerned about the venue," I said, meeting her gaze directly, "feel free to pay for the Belmont Plaza yourself. Since I'm the one covering the entire $150,000 for this wedding, I think the Grand Morrison will do just fine." The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face flushed red. She stood up so quickly, her chair scraped against the floor. "I can see I'm not welcome here," she announced, grabbing her purse. "Sarah, call me tomorrow, honey." She stormed out, the front door slamming behind her. Sarah whirled on me, her face contorted with rage. "How dare you?" she screamed. "How dare you throw the money in Mom's face like that? You're cruel and greedy, and you've ruined everything." She ran upstairs, and I heard her door slam too. I sat there, stunned, as James helped himself to another glass of wine. Later that night, he came to our bedroom looking stern. "You need to apologize to Sarah," he said. "What you said to Linda was completely out of line." I stared at him in disbelief. "Apologize? For what? Telling the truth? Your ex-wife came into my house, criticized everything I did, and then suggested I was being cheap about a wedding I'm paying for entirely on my own. Still, you didn't have to embarrass her like that. And now Sarah's upset." "I'm not apologizing," I said firmly. Not this time. He grabbed his pillow. Fine. I'll sleep in the living room until you come to your senses. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee alone in the kitchen. It was my mother. "Maddie, honey," she said, her voice concerned. "I wanted to ask you about Sarah's wedding. What's the date and venue?" "Dad and I haven't received an invitation yet, and neither has Jenny. I thought they must have gotten lost in the mail." I sat at the kitchen counter for hours after my mother's call, my coffee going cold beside me. The morning sun crawled across the floor as I waited, my anger building with each passing minute. Around 11, I heard Sarah's key in the lock. She'd been out since breakfast, probably with Linda. "Sarah," I called out, my voice steady, despite the rage simmering inside me. "We need to talk." She walked into the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes. "What is it?" she asked, not quite meeting my eyes. "I just got a call from my mother," I said, watching her face carefully. She was asking about the wedding invitations, the ones that apparently never arrived. Sarah's expression hardened, a look I'd never seen before crossing her face. She lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm not inviting them." "Excuse me?" "I'm not inviting strangers to my wedding," she said, each word deliberately cruel. The word strangers hit me like a physical blow. My parents had been at every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone for 12 years. My sister had helped Sarah prepare for her college interviews. "Strangers?" "That's wrong, Sarah," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "And it's ugly. These people have loved you and supported you for years." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound I'd never heard from her before. "You want to talk about ugly? After what you did to my mom last night?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "Actually, you know what? I don't want you at my wedding either." Time seemed to stop. The kitchen fell silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. 12 years of love, support, and sacrifice reduced to this moment. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly. "You don't want me, the person paying for your entire wedding, to attend?" "That's right," she said, lifting her chin higher. I felt an odd sense of calm wash over me. All the hurt and anger of the past few weeks crystallized into perfect clarity. I smiled, which seemed to unnerve her slightly. "That's fine," I said, my voice pleasantly light. "I won't come to your wedding." Without another word, I walked upstairs to my home office. My hands didn't shake at all as I logged into my banking app and revoked Sarah's access to the wedding account. It took less than a minute, just a few clicks to end what had taken 12 years to build. Next, I called Robert, the wedding planner. He answered on the second ring. "Robert, this is Madeline Harrison. I need you to cancel all the wedding arrangements." Excuse me?" He sounded bewildered. "Is everything all right?" "No, it's not," I said honestly. "But it will be. Please cancel everything and process the refund to my account." The Grand Morrison was my next call. The events manager was apologetic but firm. They couldn't refund the deposit for the food and beverages that had already been ordered. It was a few $1,000s lost, but at that moment, it felt like money well spent. That evening, the house was silent. James was still sleeping in the living room. I could hear him shifting on the couch as I got ready for bed. As I lay there alone in the dark, I realized I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt free. The next morning, I took my time getting dressed. I chose my favorite blue silk blouse and pearl earrings, armor, for what I knew would be a difficult day. When I finally went downstairs for breakfast, the storm broke immediately. Sarah and James were already at the kitchen table, clearly waiting for me. The moment I appeared, Sarah leaped to her feet, her face red with fury. "What did you do?" she screamed. "How dare you cancel my wedding? How dare you block my access to the account? That money was for my wedding." I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands steady. "I'm not going to sponsor a wedding I'm not invited to," I said simply, taking a sip. "You can't do this." Sarah's voice rose higher, tears starting to stream down her face. You've ruined everything. The venue, the flowers, the dress, it's all gone. I set my coffee cup down carefully. Actually, I can do this, and I did. Why don't you ask the people you actually want at your wedding to pay for it? Sarah's face crumpled. She let out a horrible, gasping sob and ran from the kitchen. Her footsteps thundered up the stairs, followed by the slam of her bedroom door. James stood up slowly, his face dark with anger. Fix this, he growled. Right now. Call everyone back, reopen the account, and arrange everything again. Or I'll file for divorce. The threat hung in the air between us. 12 years of marriage reduced to this moment. I looked at the man I'd loved, really looked at him, and wondered how I'd never seen this side of him before. Okay, I said calmly. File for divorce, I'm not against it. The color drained from his face. He clearly hadn't expected this response. Madeline, you can't be serious. I am, and since this is my house, I'd like you and Sarah to leave by tomorrow. His anger deflated like a punctured balloon. Look, he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory, I overreacted. We need to talk about this, think it through. I've already thought it through, I interrupted. I'm done living with people who don't appreciate or respect me. I'm done trying to buy love. The rest of the day passed in a blur of slammed doors and muffled arguments upstairs. At exactly 7 that evening, James and Sarah appeared in the foyer with their suitcases. Sarah's eyes were red and puffy from crying. I never thought you could be so cruel, she spat. I felt a laugh bubble up inside me, a genuine laugh of disbelief. Cruel? I paid for your clothes, your car, your education. I gave you a home, loved you like my own daughter, and was ready to spend $150,000 on your wedding. And you have the nerve to call me cruel, because I won't let you treat me like dirt. The door closed behind them with a quiet click, so much gentler than all the angry slams of the past few days. I stood in my foyer, and listened to the silence of my house. The house felt different after they left, lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had been lifted. I spent the first few days reorganizing spaces, reclaiming rooms that had slowly become filled with Sarah's things over the years. It was therapeutic, like cleaning out an old wound. Then came the message from Michael's mother. It popped up on my social media one evening while I was enjoying a glass of wine on my patio. I hope you realize what you've done, the message read. This wedding could fail entirely because of your actions. How can you be so heartless? I took my time responding, choosing my words carefully. I'm not heartless, I wrote back. I'm just done being disrespected. I won't pay for a wedding I'm not even invited to. If you're so concerned about the wedding's success, feel free to pay for it yourself. She read the message, but never replied. I imagined her sitting there, probably as shocked as James had been that I wouldn't back down. It's funny how people react when you finally stand up for yourself, like they can't quite believe you've stopped playing by their rules. I contacted my lawyer the next day. She'd helped me draft the prenup 12 years ago, and now she'd helped me end the marriage it had protected. The divorce papers were ready within a week. When I called James to tell him they were ready, he tried his old tactics again. Maddie, please, he said, his voice soft and pleading, the voice that used to make my heart melt. We can start over. We can fix this. I hung up. He came to get the papers the next morning. He looked older somehow, tired. The confident man who'd threatened me with divorce was gone, replaced by someone who seemed lost. Sarah's been crying nonstop, he said, standing in my foyer, no longer our foyer. The wedding's going to be at City Hall now. No reception, no flowers, no fancy dress. Just a basic ceremony. I shrugged, remembering all the tears I'd shed over their betrayal. That's not my problem. How can you be so cold about this? It's not cold, James. It's just not my responsibility anymore. He took the papers and left. I watched him walk to his car, the car I'd bought him, and drive away. It felt final, but not sad. Just finished. The divorce was completed 2 months later. The prenup made everything simple. He couldn't touch my house, my business, or any of my assets. Sometimes I wondered if he'd ever really read that document, if he'd understood what it meant when he signed it 12 years ago. It didn't matter now. People ask me sometimes if I know how Sarah's wedding went. If she wore the dress she'd chosen, if Linda was there, if it was everything she'd dreamed of. I honestly don't know. I blocked them all on social media, changed my phone number, moved on with my life. What I do know is this: you can't buy love. Not real love, anyway. You can't purchase respect or gratitude or loyalty. I spent 12 years trying to build a family with my checkbook, and in the end, all it got me was a front row seat to watch that family choose someone else over me. But here's the thing about endings: they're also beginnings. My house is peaceful now. My business is thriving. And when I sit in my garden with my morning coffee, watching the sun rise over my flowers, I don't feel lonely. I feel free.